I don't think it would be too hard for you to imagine a goal that you put your heart and soul into, that you strove for years to accomplish, that meant everything in the world to you, that you were passionate about. It's probably a little bit harder for you to imagine what would happen if you didn't attain the goal, to imagine that the worst would happen, that there was no place to fall back to, that there was no resort. That's easy for me to imagine. It's easy probably because I'm a visually impaired person, and there's just sort of very narrow lanes in life that I can occupy. So I can imagine a person who had to envision a future for themselves, a path for them to move forward. And if they didn't make it, there was no place to fall back to. There was no soft landing. Mary Harris Jones, who we know today as Mother Jones, was in that position, and she was in that position with millions of her fellow working class people, working class citizens. She fought for years and years and years and years to decades to forward the rights of workers, to help them earn a better living, a sustainable living. Our story begins. Fight Like Hell, The Life and Legacy of Mary Harris Jones, is a biopic about an extraordinary woman with once-in-a-generation skills of persuasion. Mary Harris Jones, better known to us as Mother Jones, was an Irish immigrant who, despite her humble beginnings on a tenant farm in Ireland, managed to attain an education, and she was refined and extremely skilled in oratory. She was passionate about the rights of workers, about wanting to help them better their lots and overcome the abject servitude and want that they were living in. It's a sweeping historic drama set against a backdrop of labor strife, social upheaval, and violence. Think Norma Ray meets Michael Collins. Mary's a petite, middle-aged woman with a commanding presence and an even more commanding voice. It's hard to imagine today, in this era of microphones and PA systems, that a woman could stand up in front of rioting strikers and armed private police and even the National Guard and manage to persuade both sides to proceed in one way or another. But she did it, and that's part of her legacy. When we meet Mary, it's 1913, and she's just arrived in Paint Creek, West Virginia. It's a scene of striking workers and private police forces clashing. Miners have left the job and are in formation around the coal mines, trying to prevent scab workers that the mine owners have hired from going forward and mining coal. It's become a matter of national importance because without coal, the trains don't run, the power plants don't fire up, people's homes don't get heated. It's very similar to the panic that we feel today when we think about, say, the Straits of Hormuz being blockaded, or that we felt in the 70s during the Arab oil embargo. The governor of Virginia has appealed to the President of the United States to allow him to declare martial law and to use the United States Army and the State National Guard against the striking workers. Mary's mission is to keep the strikers focused, to keep their will from being broken, to keep the mine owners from persuading them to return to their jobs. But she intends to accomplish this goal peacefully. It's always her goal to peacefully accomplish protest. Mary's aide and collaborator and confidant of the past 10 years is Liz O'Shea. Liz is a labor activist who hails from Krakow. Her family was an affluent Jewish family who fled Eastern Europe when the Russians annexed and conquered Poland. She's got a history of fiery activism. She was involved in the nihilistic, anarchistic movement in Chicago in the early days, and that's where she and Mary went. That's where she and Mary met. Mary, the past several years, has been under the impression that Liz's views have moderated, and they've become very close, and there seems to be a very trusting relationship between the two of them. Under the surface, though, Liz has a hidden agenda. In the aftermath of the Haymarket riots, Liz's husband was Arthur O'Shea. He was a fellow anarchist, and he was framed for murder and then tried and executed in the aftermath of the Haymarket riots in Chicago. A man named James Cooper was a labor agitator and provocateur in the employ of an industrial syndicate. And unfortunately, he's organizing the counter efforts against the demonstrators on behalf of the mine owners. One evening, after a long day of demonstrations and marches, Mary and Liz are returning to town, and they're stopped and questioned by the sheriff and his deputies. Unbeknownst to Mary, Liz is carrying a concealed weapon, which is illegal in that time and place, and that gives the sheriff the pretext he needs to arrest the two of them. The emotion and drama of the times were captured in media images. Over the course of several days, as the local authorities continue to hold Mary and Liz, agitation among the strikers increases rather than decreases, and a prosecutor makes a deal with Mary's defense counsel. The local authorities hold Mary and Liz for several days, and during that time, labor agitation increases. Mary's defense counsel receives an offer from the prosecutor to release Mary in exchange for her leaving town, and there appears to be a promise and agreement on the part of the union leaders that they'll stand down. Mary is released. Mary goes to the train station, but she can't bring herself to abandon her fellow unionists. She changes her mind, turns around, goes back into town, gets back up on the stump, and gets right back down to business. That night, a brawl erupts between striking unionists and some of the private police in the employ of the mine owners. And the next day, the governor, by order of the president, declares martial law. Mary's arrested and charged with attempted murder and subjected to a court-martial. She refuses to participate in preparations for trial because she is not willing to admit the authenticity of the proceedings. Shortly after she's placed under house arrest, Mary falls ill with pneumonia and is delirious with fever for several days. During that time, she has nightmares about the death of her 4 small children in a yellow fever epidemic. In her dreams, she sees herself in the next phase of her life in Chicago with a new business and new friends, and then it's all destroyed by the Great Fire in 1871. Over the years, she's gained a lot of influence with politicians and wealthy activists, and as she recovers from her illness, she begins a letter-writing campaign. Liz is suspicious of Mary's influential connections, and she begins a whisper campaign that Mary has sold out. Mary's convicted at trial and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Before she's transferred to a federal prison, the governor of Indiana intercedes on her behalf, and the charges are dropped. Liz is bent on escalating the conflict with James Cooper. She's joined forces with a violent splinter group of unionists and has organized a march, which is to occur the following day. Mary's informants tell her that the march is exactly the provocation that James Cooper has been looking for in order to convince the governor to allow the National Guard to mow down the protesters and slaughter them. Mary's desperate to save the lives of the protesters. She calls herself their mother. They're her boys. She wants to be a good mother, and to her, true test of a good mother is to be able to save her children, to keep them from dying. She's always been a woman of strength and integrity, but in this moment she resorts to subterfuge. She tells the leaders of the march that she's received a telegram from the president promising to order the private police forces to stand down if the marchers will do the same, if they'll go home in peace. Mary convinces them to stand down, but her reputation's in tatters. She suffers an emotional breakdown and returns to the safety of her farm in Maryland. Some years later, two young men who were on the line of march that day come to the farm and thank her for saving their life. Mary returns to activism just in time to encounter a new round of protests and deadly counter-protests. Across the country today, people worry about the erosion of their rights and the growing gulf between the wealthy and the poor. Just as we're on the verge of celebrating the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, we wonder if we'll continue to make progress. There's an appetite for intelligent films about people who stand up and fight,